Hello and welcome to this Tuesday's morning market briefing. We've got lots to talk about, but firstly, Ryanair offers to take Boeing 737 MAX aircraft if US airlines pull orders, as well as that EU agrees to set aside profits from frozen Russian assets. We've got lots to talk about in the charts. Also, with lots happening on the economic calendar. We'll come to that near the end, so make sure you stay around so you see that. Before we get straight into it, make sure to subscribe. The first article to talk about, of course, is with Ryanair. Now, Ryanair has now made its offer to purchase more Boeing 737 MAXs should any US airlines decide to cancel their orders. This all, of course, comes following deepening manufacturing problems with the plane manufacturer. But ultimately, this is not the first time we've, of course, spoken about Ryanair recently, with, of course, Ryanair with its Boeing 737 MAX craft having a great deal of issues, especially in relation to a part of its fuselage actually blowing out and blowing off. And this happened on an Alaska Airlines flight. I can't pinpoint the date off the top of my head, but it was not too long ago. And since then, we have seen an investigation take place by US authorities to try and determine who is kind of at fault here, as ultimately, whilst no casualties or injuries were reported from the incident, it's a very worrying incident to say the least. This was kind of a blocked up section which would usually act as a door, but they'd kind of blocked it up and nobody was sitting near. So despite it blowing out, once the oxygen masks dropped, everyone was okay basically, and they were able to just return to the airport they took off from in Portland, Oregon, I believe, and kind of just land the plane safely, which of course is a massive risk to other types of aircraft. And that's why we did see many of these US planes, US aircraft companies kind of halt their use of the plane, with US authorities also grounding the planes until further investigations have come to a conclusion. And this came as a big worry towards Boeing, and a big worry in relation to Boeing stock, of course. And as a result, we did see a bit of a sell-off as a result of that, as people did worry, could this be an issue across other Boeing planes? What could this mean for Boeing? Could Boeing get sued? And I remember, coming out of that period where we were talking about that incident, we were trying to find who was to blame here. Was it Alaska Airlines in some way with their maintenance crews, or was it in fact an issue to do with Boeing and their inspectors before they sent that off to Alaska Airlines for their use? And it was very new plane that Alaska Airlines was using, and that's why the blame did initially kind of go towards Boeing, who had just kind of finished manufacturing the plane before Alaska Airlines did take it on and use it. And that's when we did see the incident. And so that was the key issue and worry. We were always expecting some sort of lawsuit or some sort of fine or confiscation as a result of that, which would of course massively damage Boeing. And of course, we're still waiting for certain information in regards to that investigation, which is taking place in regards to Boeing and that 737 MAX 10 incident. And once we do have all that information, we could have a better view on the Boeing stock. But ultimately, keeping on top of what other airlines are thinking is also very important, with Ryanair being a key airline operator in the in Europe as a whole, being a very key player, and some a kind of a carrier which usually operates on shorter haul flights, and therefore having these smaller, shorter haul planes like the Boeing 737 Maxes do make more sense. But ultimately, we do have those issues which could be continue across other sorts of models for Boeing, and therefore that's the worry, whether if Ryanair do go on to purchase these planes, and as a result they come into the same issues that Alaska Airlines did see, then we could see great ramifications for Ryanair and a great deal of negligence put on them. So that's why it's so important to stay on top of what's going on in regards to Boeing, of course. Now, this move would continue to prove that Ryanair is Boeing's greatest industry supporter, with Boeing being plunged into a crisis after a fuselage blowout on a flight recently. Since then, US airline bosses have directed their frustration towards Boeing, with United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby asking key questions over an order of 737 MAX 10s. As of course, whilst this incident did occur, many other US carriers such as United had already put in orders for the same aircraft, and therefore that was the key worry was, are we going to get these aircraft and not be able to use them? And for Boeing, the key issue was, will these people kind of cancel their orders? Will they take us to court? And what kind of issues will arise out of this issue? And that's why it was such a big worry and such a big issue for Boeing stock as well. So it's so important to understand what's going on. Now, the Ryanair CEO Michael O'Leary, in response to such questions, has supported Boeing by offering to buy up and receive the MAX 10's orders should other airlines not want them. Ryanair is a large customer of the MAX family, with an order book of over 400 new 737 MAX 8s and MAX 10s, with the MAX 8s being expected to arrive before the summer. So whilst the MAX 10s are not expected for some time, we are expecting those MAX 8s very, very soon, which is why it's so important to know what's going on. Now, as for Ryanair's MAX 10s orders, these are not expected until 2027, however. Ryanair is, however, currently in a difficult situation after having to cut its annual profit forecast following being forced to lower fares in order to fill empty seats. And this is something that we're likely to see across many of these short-haul, low-fare airlines as a result of fuel costs as well. Several major travel companies have also stopped selling Ryanair flights in December after accusations were made against Ryanair over inflating its prices for flights. So very, very important news in regards to the airline industry, and will definitely be playing into the way that Boeing does move today and over the next week and longer, really. So definitely keep your eyes on Boeing. It's a very interesting stock to be looking at the moment, especially in consideration of all these issues. That's all to talk about on the topic of Ryanair and Boeing. Keep your eyes on all of that. Next to talk about, though, is the EU, which has now agreed to set aside profits from Russian assets. Now, a plan has been backed by EU members to set aside billions of euros of assets, and this comes following the freezing of Russia's central bank's assets to use for Ukraine. Now, we actually don't talk too much. We haven't spoken about, the issue of the frozen Russian assets too much, really. And that's largely because, certain issues in relation to Russia's invasion into Ukraine are more important in regards to the economy sometimes, just out of, the aspects of how it affects scarcity, especially of certain commodities such as wheat, but also how, of course, it affects certain markets such as gold, which, of course, is a very important market that we look at. And through this invasion into Ukraine, we did see a great deal of volatility and a great deal of bullish momentum for gold, as of course gold is a key safe haven asset. And so in these times of kind of all-out war and mass invasions and that kind of thing, we will see these assets like gold, like other commodities like oil, rush to the upside. And that's what we're kind of seeing now take place in regards to Israel and Gaza, and also with the Houthis in the Red Sea. And we could also see this, of course, should China invade Taiwan or any issues do arise in the Chinese Southeast Sea. May have pronounced that wrong, but yeah, no, definitely keep your eyes on things in relation to that. But coming back to the topic of these frozen assets, ultimately this would be a really interesting topic. This is such an important topic, just in regards to how this kind of sets out the kind of law or proceedings in regards to when you freeze another country's assets. Many nations such as Canada, the US and UK previously have encouraged the EU, which froze many Russian assets, to basically just put this towards their usual common budget. But the EU has ultimately, due to the fact that it is far closer to Russia than any of these other nations, economically and geographically, ultimately we have seen the EU be very hesitant of this, as ultimately, should the EU kind of go ahead and do such like an aggressive measure, we could see Russia kind of take the same actions in the future, or even other nations may take the same sort of actions in the future. So it kind of sets that kind of worrying precedent, which is why we kind of have seen the EU be very hesitant with it. But now we are seeing not the EU putting all those assets towards the EU's common budget, but instead setting aside the profits being made by such Russian assets and then putting that towards Ukraine. Now, the decision was unanimous and represents continued support for Kyiv, whilst Ukraine continues to deal with the very serious situation of Russia's invasion. As well as this decision, EU leaders on Thursday are expected to provide Ukraine with 50 billion euros in financial support should all leaders sign off on it. Before this decision on frozen assets, 191 billion euros of the 260 billion euros of Russian foreign reserves frozen after the invasion into Ukraine were earning profits in Belgium's central security depository, where the securities would reach maturity and then be reinvested. Now these profits from investments will be set aside to be used for support for Ukraine. The time of choosing for when such profits will be provided to Ukraine has not yet been decided, however, but ultimately remains in accordance with contractual obligations. The European Commission has been hesitant before to seize the profits and just transfer them to the EU budget due to fears that Russia may somehow retaliate and do the same. So very, very important to keep your eyes on anything in regards to Russia, but also Russia's assets, which of course have been frozen. Many of these Western nations and communities following, of course, their invasion into Ukraine. Keep your eyes on all of that. Next to talk about, though, of course, is the charts. We're done with the articles, so next to talk about is the charts, where we do have some very interesting things to note on the US 30, where we are now seeing a continuation of that bullish momentum that we did note yesterday. And this obviously follows on Friday, there being that kind of push to the upside where price did just kind of shoot above the all-time high for the US 30 shortly before returning back below it. And so we weren't sure whether this was representing clear bullish momentum to the upside, as ultimately, this could still reference kind of that weak momentum when we're not seeing, certain candles close above all-time highs, and therefore maybe we're seeing just that lack of support to the upside. But we have seen now, following yesterday's price action movements, we have seen price push all the way to the upside, and now has nearly reached that minus 27.2% Fibonacci extension level. So it will be very interesting to see if we do come into contact with that level. But that said, ultimately, whilst we are seeing this kind of bullish momentum to the upside, I think it still is important to note the fact that we are still seeing a kind of bearish divergence exist on that kind of RSI index. If we just look here, should the US 30, let's say, create an all-time high at that minus 27.2% Fibonacci level, we could still see a very clear bearish divergence on the RSI form. And therefore, could we be looking at another sell side opportunity on the US 30? Maybe not. Maybe, in fact, fundamentals of this week, which is very, very important considering how much news we're getting in regards to the US. That news that's coming out in regards to the Fed, as well as the NFP figures, that's going to be very important in regards to the US 30. So maybe that bearish divergence doesn't play into it too much, but still keep your eyes on the US 30 as it's ultimately making new highs and it's in a very, very interesting position. Next to talk about is dollar, which is kind of ranging around and is at the top of that range at the moment, whilst we do wait for some key US data this week. As I just mentioned, we will be getting the Fed's interest rate decision this week, as well as the US NFP figure on Friday, which of course shapes a lot of that Fed's monetary policy kind of outlook. And that's why we're kind of seeing this slowdown on the dollar, especially as investors do wait to hear the news before we see the dollar make a move to the upside or downside, as we're kind of in the lead up to that, we are kind of seeing price range around, and that is because these financial institutions, these investors, do kind of hedge their bets on the upside and downside in these key liquidity zones as they do wait for these key figures to come out. So definitely keep your eyes on dollar, especially as we will be getting some important information this week. Next to talk about is Euro USD, where we are seeing kind of some slow moves to the downside. Not too much momentum to the downside though, and ultimately, we have peaked, we have dropped, below those lowest lows for which we haven't seen really since start of December. But that said, we're not seeing an overwhelming amount of bearish momentum. But the key thing, just like we said with the dollar, of course, is the economic data that we are getting this week, which will be definitely influencing the way that Euro USD does move, as we are sitting on that 78.60 Fibonacci level, and we are getting some key Eurozone news this week, as well as that Fed news that I just spoke about. So definitely keep your eyes on Euro USD, not one to rule out just yet. Next to talk about is pound yen. Still not too much to say on pound yen, as price is still stalling and is halted at that kind of liquidity level at the top side of pound yen's all-time highs. If we do finally break out to the upside, we will definitely see, or possibly not see, but definitely look out for a kind of retracement and a tap of that liquidity level that we're kind of sitting at right now, and then before we then see a continuation to the upside. So keep your eyes on pound yen. Next to talk about is Bitcoin, where we are seeing price now continue to the upside and push to higher levels. This is quite interesting to note, of course, considering the fact that recently we did come into that key liquidity zone, which lined up with a key Fibonacci level, but it does seem that we don't have that bearish momentum to the downside, and the sell volume has now been exhausted following the ETF approval. So those investors that wanted to get out in the process of that ETF approval, those investors that did get out have now got out, and now we're seeing the kind of return of that bullish momentum, like I kind of almost predicted when we were talking about the reason why we did see that sell-off following the ETF approvals. So keep your eyes on Bitcoin. Next to talk about is gold though. Not too much to say on gold, but definitely the Fed's interest rate decision this week and the NFP data will push gold to the upside or downside. But also, as I spoke about on the last article, definitely listen out for any world tensions news, as that will be pushing gold as well. So listen out for all of that and keep your eyes on gold. Lastly, to talk about on the charts though is oil, which of course saw a great deal of bullish momentum as we did end off last week. But entering this week, it does seem like we've sold off from that key liquidity zone near and around that 84.5 level. As you can see here, this was a key liquidity zone which price had reacted with great sell volume from before, and we have now reacted in a bearish manner from that level. So definitely keep your eyes on oil. We could just see a short retracement though before continuation to the upside. If I do bring up the 38.20, you can see that we're nearing around that key Fibonacci level, which does line up with some short-term liquidity. So still keep your eyes on oil moves to the upside. Definitely an interesting area to note always. Lastly to talk about, of course, because we're done with the charts now, lastly to talk about, of course, is the economic calendar. But today we are getting a lot of economic data, so listen out for all of this to come. So firstly, we will be getting Aussie retail sales figures, as well as the Swiss balance of trade figure. Next, we'll be getting Spanish GDP growth rate and inflation rate figure, so important Eurozone data there. And followed by that, Eurozone, German and Italian GDP growth rate figures. So very important Eurozone data in regards to growth. That'll be weighing on the way people see the ECB forming that monetary policy. So keep your eyes on all of that. Next, we'll be getting British mortgage and lending data, so definitely listen out for all of that. And followed by that, Eurozone consumer confidence and industrial sentiment figures, so lots of Eurozone data to note, definitely. Lastly, we'll be getting US consumer confidence figures and Bank of Japan's industrial production and retail sales figures. So lots and lots of data to listen out for, but we've covered lots in the articles, lots on the charts, and lots on the economic calendar. You have a great trading day, but that's all from us at Wildwood Capital. Have a great one. See you later. Bye.